My name is Rev.
Hi, this is Michael.
Welcome to another episode of Race Economics Club. Today talking about market structures, monopolies part 2.
Yeah.
So last videos we concluded that monopolies are not socially optimal, they're inefficient.
Yeah.
So what does that exactly mean? Well, inefficiency in economics is always usually measured by deadweight loss or loss of total surplus in the market. Total surplus being consumer and producer surplus combined. And so we see here a marginal revenue, because in a monopoly we produce where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. However, marginal revenue is not equal to demand in a monopolist firm.
Sure.
And so as a result, this is our production point for a monopolies firm. But in a perfectly competitive firm at PC, basically, since in a perfectly competitive industry using the Mr. Darp rule, marginal revenue equals demand. The demand curve in a perfectly competitive firm will be our marginal revenue curve. And so that is where the perfectly competitive firm would produce at. Yeah. Where demand meets marginal cost.
Yes. So it's actually the supply curve, as we mentioned before.
There's a clear difference between the quantity produced in these two industries. And so that is what a perfect competitive firm industry will be based the socially optimal industry at this point.
Sure.
Maximum production point. However, at this point, we see here, since this difference between quantity produced creates a deadweight loss, because the difference between quantity produced means a difference between producer and consumer surplus or total surplus. Yes. And so that creates deadweight loss.
Yeah, actually, it's already mentioned here. As long as we don't produce at a socially optimal point, actually, when the demand meets supply, just remember our supply curve is the same as marginal cost curve, as we mentioned before in the earlier episodes. So as long as the quantity is not at this point C, where the demand meets supply, then we always have this triangle. What? Deadweight loss. Yeah. Right. Deadweight loss because reducing output. Because our output is reduced because of monopoly, right? From the competitive to the monopoly level, that means basically the consumer surplus transferred to the monopoly firm as part of the economic profit, right here. Okay, so it's pretty. Actually, it's very similar with the deadweight loss we discussed in the earlier episodes. Yes. Okay, so
and so because of that, we see that there's a deadweight loss there. However, beyond that, we also see the consumer surplus and monopoly firm and a monopoly industry. It's basically, since this is the price we produce at this quantity produced at, the consumer surplus is only about this portion up here, this small portion.
Exactly.
Compared to in a perfect competitive firm, where it would be this entire portion right here.
Yes, a socially optimal part is
So you may be wondering, well, this part is already lost to a deadweight loss because we produce less. However, this portion right here is taken as our marginal revenue because marginal revenue this is taken as our total profit for our
economic profit for the monopoly company.
In a perfectly competitive industry, this initial part would still be part of
consumer surplus.
But in a monopoly, since we produce profit, this difference right here is part of our monopoly's profit, and that monopoly's profit is converted from consumer surplus. So surplus, consumer surplus, and converted into profit for monopolist firm.
Exactly. Yeah.
And so and so we see that happen.
Yeah.
And so basically, what happens without price discrimination? Well, basically, compared to a perfectly competitive industry, in a perfectly competitive industry, this demand curve is our marginal revenue curve. But in a monopolist industry, this is our marginal revenue curve right here. It's different. There's twice the slope of the demand curve. And so our average total cost curve is right here, and our overall production point price minus our average total cost point is our profit in unregulated monopoly.
Yeah, it's actually just a repeat of what we just discussed, okay, because for the unregulated monopoly, quantity is reduced. Price is increased.
However, if we regulate a monopoly to produce at the point, disregarding their own personal marginal revenue curve for that industry, for that firm, if we force them or basically regulate them to produce at the socially optimal point where demand curve equals our marginal cost curve right here, that will be our socially optimal point production and price.
Yeah, it really means when we said socially optimal really means no deadweight loss.
Yes.
Well, the demand meet supply.
Because that's the same price and production point where a perfectly competitive firm will produce at, or perfectly competitive industry will produce at.
Yeah, so that's basically it's MC meet with the demand.
And that will decrease our profit to this point, this more narrow rectangle right here. Right here in the neon green. However, there's also a fair return point, basically where since it's a perfectly competitive industry and its firms in the long run produces zero economic profit, if we were to regulate that same policy towards a monopolist firm, then if we were to have them produce at the point where demand or the price level equals their average total cost point, because that difference is their profit. If we make the difference zero, then make normal profit or zero profit, then that increases our production point to our
even more,
fair return point, and that decreases our profit to zero right here.
It's actually pretty simple to remember. For the socially optimal means no deadweight loss. Basically means P equals MC. Okay, P equals supply. Okay, demand equals supply. And for the fair return, usually fair return means normal profit. Okay, that's an economic, common knowledge. So the fair return really means what? P equals ATC. That's how normal profit is defined, right? Normal profit means zero economic profit, so P equals ATC. Okay, so this graph actually gives you just a glimpse about all three different, price and three different quantities for a monopoly.
We see these regulations often are applied for previously talk about such as utility industries, which produce at a free fair return or socially optimal point. So, but monopolies can also price discriminate. Remember, monopolies are price makers. Monopolists are not price takers. So, a monopolist, they can either set a uniform single price for every single produce of good or service in every single consumer, or they can price discriminate, meaning for different consumers with different demands or different basically demand ceilings or highest demand, highest price they were willing to buy at is different, and so the monopolists will produce at different prices for those different individual consumers. For instance, they will produce at the highest price willing to be paid at for each individual consumer, theoretically in a perfectly price discriminating monopolist.
Yes.
Now, of course, this is not always legal, but there are still a way to circumvent legal barriers and to price discriminate to some level.
As long as you can perfectly discriminate, price, and then so each customer has to pay the highest they can afford, right?
So
in this case, there's a great allocation efficiency, although it's not good. It says the last price paid always equals MC. So the MC curve is still similar as we see before. The ATC curve is still similar as we seen before.
Because in a price discriminating monopolist, they no longer have a separate marginal revenue curve from their demand curve.
It's the same.
If the monopolist wants to produce at a higher point, they don't have to lower prices across the board. They can have their existing consumers pay the prices they're still paying, but to have their new consumers pay the lower price that they're willing to pay only for those new consumers, but to have their existing consumers pay to still their original prices they were paying. That's what it means to price discriminate. So they do not have to adjust prices across the board to increase production, and thus their old marginal revenue curve becomes obsolete, and their new marginal revenue curve and the price discriminating monopolist for a price discriminating monopolist becomes the Mr. Darp rule, where marginal revenue equals demand.
So we can apparently see the economic profit on the price discrimination is significantly increased because now. Unlike the single price monopolist, consumer has zero surplus.
Yes, because every consumer is now paying a different price according to what their highest according to what their highest price willing to be paid at is. And so all that consumer surplus is now absorbed as profit for a monopolist.
Transferred to the economic profit.
But the pro of that, or the benefit of that, relatively speaking, in the overall industry is that we produce at a higher point, we produce at a socially optimal point, or we increase our efficiency because now the monopoly firm industry produces like a perfect competitive industry in terms of quantity produced. The price is different for each individual.
There is very little deadweight loss, but the trade-off is basically the monopolist takes virtually all the surplus.
Basically, each individual consumer, instead of having some consumers having consumer surplus, every consumer now pays the highest level that they have to pay or they're willing to pay.
Exactly.
And that's only for a monopoly that price discriminates perfectly or has perfect price discrimination. So monopoly also still mentioned inefficient. They create deadweight loss. They create less quantity produced and higher prices than the fair return point or even the social optimum point of a perfectly competitive industry. If price discrimination exists, one part of that problem is solved in that we produce at the same quantity that is socially optimal. However, prices are still quite high because each consumer pays their highest overall price level. And so, but in a price discriminating monopoly at a perfect price discrimination level, Mr. Darp rule still applies for marginal revenue equals demand instead of having a separate marginal revenue curve from our demand curve. And we see this from our graphics because we see the graphics see how the monopolist absorbs all consumer surplus as profit, but instead, as a trade-off, produces at a higher quantity.
Yeah, so I think that again that means actually we need to pay attention because the graphics are really important in microeconomic studies. So hopefully that's really helpful, and see you next time. Bye bye.